Thank you, Olav, for agreeing to be part of this research project as part of the doctoral dissertation titled Social Inclusion and Participation in the Design of the Post-2015 Development Agenda, now known as Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Your role and experience in this post-2015 process will provide significant input about the level of social inclusion of this development process. Thank you, Olav. How are you?
Oh, thank you. Pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute. My name is Olav Kjørven. I'm a Director of Public Partnerships here at UNICEF. I used to head the Bureau for Development Policy at UNDP, and in that capacity played a relatively central role in organizing the UN's work on this agenda.
Thank you, Olav. In your opinion, what is the value or importance of social inclusion and participation during the design of the post-2015 development agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, I think participation by people around the world in the whole experience of negotiating first, having conversations about and then negotiating the new development agenda was enormously important. When we were thinking about how do we help member states arrive at a new development agenda to take over after the Millennium Development Goals a few years back, I think a lot of us realized that we had no other option than to try to make the process open and inclusive, to get the voices of people around the world to be part of the process. This had to do with concerns about legitimacy, that one couldn't for a second time kind of spring an entire development agenda on the world without engaging with the world in what it should look like. It had worked the first time because it was the first time that the world had goals, so no one expected to be part of something like that. And Kofi Annan basically announced the MDGs and they were somehow accepted. But we knew that that could not happen again, that there had to be an open and inclusive process. We also knew that unlike in around the year 2000, we had the tools to make this a very open process because of what had happened with connectivity, telecommunications, social media, and so on. So we had the tools to basically bring the voices of people around the world to a multilateral UN deliberation process, which was very exciting because for the first time we could actually do something like this. And then finally, it was enormously important because if we had left it to people from governments, from ministries of foreign affairs, etc., to negotiate this behind closed doors, I don't think they would have succeeded. And I don't think they would have come up with the kind of agenda that we need for the future. It was precisely because the doors and the windows were opened and sunlight could fall in on the process that made it much more difficult for governments to go for lowest common denominators or to sabotage and let this process fail, which a lot of people thought it would. It didn't because people followed it, people were interested, and also the governments that were negotiating, they benefited tremendously from the inputs, and the inputs of people had an impact on the outcome.
Thank you. So how was social participation influenced the post-2015 process, and what mechanisms were the most important to you?
Well, how social participation influenced was basically there were several tracks, so to speak. There were national consultations that were organized around the world in more than 100 countries, where UN country teams basically worked with governments and with civil society to stage open discussions about what sort of agenda people in all these different countries wanted. What were the important issues to them, and all of that was basically captured in a report that was put together by the UN system, and that was one very important input. The second important input were global thematic consultations that were basically practitioners and experts in different fields had global discussions virtually, as well as meeting at real places in time and space to explore different issues like inequality, for instance, or energy, or peace and security, or governance, and several other themes like that, education, health, and those consultations really also gave a very solid input from people that were either, as I said, practitioners or experts, and from all over the world. So again, that was also very important to build awareness and legitimacy, and that became a second major input into this whole overall effort organized by the UN. And the third was the famous My World survey, which basically was a way to invite people to prioritize what were the most important issues for them. And this went out both online as well as offline, and depending on the country, reaching very high numbers of people, and that gave us another indication of what sort of world do people want to live in, and all of this was important because it made it impossible for let's say a particular government to argue that, let's say, a sensitive topic like inequality was not important. We knew it was important because we had millions of people telling us that it was important. In addition to this, there were many other avenues as well that sprung up in civil society to also provide very broad-based input into this process. Beyond 2015 is one example of a network in civil society that mobilized tremendously. And there were also the scientific community through the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and there was also targeted engagement towards the private sector through the Global Compact. So there were many efforts that kind of sprung up to open this whole process up for engagement by people around the world, and all of this added up to a quite astonishing wave of input from millions of people. And I think that all of it added up and had a big impact. And it's difficult to rate one thing in particular, although if you sort of force me, I think perhaps the My World survey was particularly important, because there we really got a very clear sense of where people's priorities in from 193 countries what they were, and people really elevated kind of the classical MDG themes like education and health, but they also elevated jobs, and they elevated peace and security, and they elevated the importance of responsive and responsible government. In other words, the whole democratic governance agenda. And all this helped us then from the UN system side, and on the basis of our norms and our principles, to advocate vis-a-vis member states for these issues to be included.
So in your view, was the design of the post-2015 agenda an inclusive process, and what evidence is there?
Everything I've said, right, points to this as being a very inclusive process. I would say by far the most inclusive process ever that the UN has ever, embarked on. If you look at the history of negotiations in the UN since its founding in 1945, you won't find a single major multilateral negotiation where the voice of people was factored into the proceedings. Never. Except, if you count like trade negotiations where you had, civil society interest groups obviously lobbying and demonstrating and, demanding change from the streets. But these people were rarely brought into the room, and there was no structured way for the people's voice to be considered in a negotiation. What was really different this time was that not only did we manage to stimulate, that voice of the people, the kind of the we the people's input into what was going on, but we were able to connect the results of all this consultation and all this engagement in terms of the results of it into the formal negotiation process. So people were negotiating with this input on their desks as they were sitting over in the ECOSOC chamber or in General Assembly or wherever they were sitting, or in meeting rooms. And that had never happened before in the history of the UN. And it's very important to understand this, and particularly when we think about what sort of multilateral process should we think about for the future.
Thank you. And how familiar are you with the results of the My World Survey, the UN system consultations you mentioned, civil society consultations, the UN Global Pulse big data tools, and have you participated, interacted, designed, or implemented any of these instruments? And were these results, to your opinion, transparent and accessible? I guess you have answered some of that.
Yeah, obviously I have. I'm very familiar with all of that, and I personally oversaw the development of some of these mechanisms. The national and global consultations and the My World Survey were projects under my supervision. I didn't develop it. That was staff and directors with specific responsibilities for the different elements that did. But I did oversee that broad effort, and I was co-chairing the task force within the UN Development Group that brought the UN system together to provide guidance and direction for all of these efforts. So, what was your final question related to this?
Were these results transparent and accessible?
I would say they were. I mean, nothing is ever perfect. Things can always get more transparent and more accessible. But I think we basically broke new ground and set a new standard in the UN's, in the history of the UN, for how you open up a multilateral process, how you make it accessible for people, how you ask for and how you receive inputs, and how you translate that into something that has consequence in negotiations among member states. And I think in all those respects, we set a new standard of transparency and inclusion.
So do you think that the results of the aforementioned tools were useful or easy to make sense of?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it was a huge effort by our teams, people from different UN agencies that were brought together to basically make sense of what came in. So it had to be synthesized, and it had to take a lot of input and then kind of discover what were the trends in what people were saying, and capturing that and categorizing that. And that was a big effort. But I think we did that fairly well. One can always question whether all of what was done was, completely up to standard. There might have been points and there might have been examples where somebody read too much of their own personal preferences and biases into what we were getting. But I do think we had checks and balances to deal with that, and to present something that was representative and fair vis-a-vis what we had received. But I'm not saying that it was all perfect. It was not.
Sure. In your view, were these results presented in a timely manner to policymakers? Did they have any impact on the design, on the final design of the post-2015 agenda? And do you think the SDG proposal is inclusive?
Say that again.
Do you think that these results were presented in a timely manner to policymakers? Did they have any impact on the design of the post-2015 agenda? And do you think that the SDG proposal is included?
I would say yes to all three. Obviously, the timeliness could be a challenge because the timeline for instance, the high-level panel was tight, and it was very important to have results that could influence the report of the high-level panel. But in the end, we were able to do that. I mean, we worked very closely with the secretariat of the high-level panel, and we were able to provide our inputs as the report was being written, and as important meetings took place in the high-level panel. By the time the open working group got going, which was really where the real negotiations took place, we had most of the input from the consultations in place, and we provided the results of the consultations to that process, and it had a very tangible impact on the outcomes. So I would say yes.
Did you feel represented during the SDG design process as an individual? And what could have been improved in terms of social participation during the design of the post-2015 agenda and the SDG?
Well, personally, I was part of it, right? So, and I felt very privileged to be in a position where I could help set up the mechanisms for social participation. That also gave me, of course, the opportunity to share with colleagues and with member states my own views as to what this agenda should aim for. And so I think I was in a very privileged position both to help set up the mechanisms for participation and at the same time influence the process myself. Sorry, the final question there.
So do you think that if you could improve in terms of social participation during the design process, what would you have been able to improve?
I think in retrospect there are many things that one could have done better and differently. Let's say there had been a bit more time to have even more broad-based consultations in relation to the first phase, really, which was the time of the high-level panel. We could have had more robust results earlier than was possible. But this is about the art of the possible. You can't not do something because you don't have all the time in the world. So we had to make the most of a challenging timeline and resource constraints. I mean, we had to raise quite a lot of contributions from a number of donors to be able to pull all of this off. And so a lot of time and effort was spent fundraising. And there was no other way to do that. Of course, if we had a discretionary budget that we could have used to make this happen up front, then that would have been better, easier. But the world isn't like that. We have to deal with the cards that we have and make the most of it. I think one can always think of ways in terms of methodologies that could have given us even better and clearer input from different stakeholders, be it the private sector, the science community or citizenry. The My World survey could probably have been even better than it was, but these are, we were doing so many things for the first time, and we did fairly well, I think, given that, and given the time constraints and the resource constraints, I thought we did really well. But yes, we have learned from this, and I think next time we move ahead with a major we the people's kind of to negotiations at the global level, we can hopefully do an even better job.
Thank you. Can you describe at least 2 examples or programs and or policies designed to foster inclusion and participation?
Could you repeat that question? Yeah.
Can you describe at least 2 examples of programs and or policies designed to foster social inclusion and participation?
Sorry, I'm not totally sure what you have in mind here.
So if you could think of, either programs within your line of work or policies that have been designed that you are aware of, where their purpose was to foster social inclusion and participation in the overall day-to-day life of citizens, within government or within the development world. So programs and or policies, that were designed with that intention of broadening the participation. We could think of Rio plus 20 setting the theme or the scene rather of inclusive participation within the negotiations of the SDG. So in a sense, Rio could be an example, but if you can think of tangible ones, that's fine.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, there are many examples of, programs, policies out there where either the objective has been participation or where means to achieve objectives have been based on, participatory approaches. I mean, in the history of development, there are multiple examples, right? I mean, even programs to build democratic governance, right, through electoral processes, which is something that UNDP, for instance, does quite a lot. It's about creating, democratic participation, right, in the fabric of society through elections. So that's happening, around the world all the time. You have programs where you use participatory approaches to understand what are people's priorities, and then you use the same approaches to basically create a movement, if you wish, of people at the local level that are engaged in addressing whatever challenges that you are focusing on. So it can be in relation to gender empowerment, women's empowerment or gender equality, dealing with issues like child marriage or female genital mutilation, or combating HIV/AIDS, where you really need grassroots engagement or the engagement of organizations that are active and work on behalf of people to achieve those results. So I think at the country level there are many examples of this in practice. But what was new with the process we're talking about here, of course, was that we took that approach and applied it to a global negotiation process. That was really new.
So I think perhaps you also already have answered this one, but can you describe at least two cases where inclusion and participation were decisive in the designing inclusive and successful public policies?
I think there are many examples. Again, are we talking at the country level now, in your view, or are we?
It could be, yeah, it could be at the country level, it could be globally.
Again, I mean, they give examples from the gender equality area, where I think a lot of progress that we have seen, again related to child marriage or violence against women or violence against children, female genital mutilation, efforts to both prevent HIV/AIDS or expand treatment, where there has been big efforts to build awareness in the population, and then identify organizations at the grassroots level, sometimes faith-based organizations, that one can work with and through to bring about social change. And this has been a common approach in many areas. Probably not common enough, because I think we need to become much better at working with and through actors and people that live their lives and struggle with their challenges in their own local communities. And so whether we're talking about coming to terms with environmental challenges that are undermining, because of environmental degradation, livelihoods in communities around the world, or we're talking about, again, issues such as gender, or we're talking about social protection, working with, for instance, the labor movement to bring about stronger social safety nets for people and entitlement, programs that provide, whether it's pensions or it's child payments in support of children. That we've seen huge rollout of these kinds of programs in many countries over the last 10, 15 years. All of this depends on building broad constituencies for change, and that's why it's so important to work with and through civil society and connect with the real, both the challenges that people face in their daily lives, but also their hopes and dreams for the future.
So you mentioned UNDP's work on fostering inclusion and participation within their governance framework. On this question, if you were to name or highlight some of those policies, which are the agencies that you could say, it could be 2 or 3, that are carrying out this work, in terms of HIV/AIDS, that you could, or children, the examples that you mentioned, which would be the reference points?
Well, it's dangerous to single some agencies out, because I think it's a lot of organizations in development, they work to greater or lesser extent trying to build participatory approaches into their way of working. So yes, UNDP certainly, both when it comes to issues related to the environment or democratic governance or combating HIV/AIDS. I'm sure if you talk to UNFPA, they can give you many examples of how they work with communities and with broader movements to foster change when it comes to reproductive and sexual rights. UNICEF definitely is very committed to working with communities and civil society organizations, grassroots organizations, to bring about change in children's lives. But I could probably go on and on, when it comes to that, and also beyond the UN, NGOs and other organizations as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful, Olav. Last question. Taking into account the lessons of the post-2015 design process, can you name at least 3 recommendations to fostering inclusion and participation in specific terms around the implementation of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs?
Recommendations for the implementation phase?
For the inclusive and participatory implementation, yeah.
Okay. Well, I certainly believe very strongly that we have to continue to foster participation in, throughout the 15 years of implementation of the SDGs. It's at least as important as it was for the formation of the agenda. We can't drop the ball in terms of the voice of people and kind of the we the people element of this agenda. Now that we have finally arrived and we have this agenda ready for takeoff. So I think we need to bring that dimension into the way we work going forward in several important respects. One is in landing the agenda at the country level, that we as a UN country team certainly, that we reach out to governments and try to foster participation in terms of defining how to get started, what sort of issues to focus on in each and every country, and not just kind of technocratically decide, okay, we're going to zoom in on these 3 issues and then plow ahead as governments, but to open this up for the opportunity for people to participate in and feeling that they're part of an important journey. And this is also a way to escape a little bit the dilemma that governments face as they feel they have to prioritize. They can't move forward on 17 goals and 169 targets at equal speed. No government can do that. It's not possible. They have to prioritize somehow. But governments can definitely create space. And I'm not really talking about financing here, but create space for different actors in society, be it the private sector or civil society, to move forward on whatever is of their interest or their capacity or their expertise, so that the government might decide that, for instance, sustainable cities is not something we can focus on initially. That shouldn't stop mayors and local governments and business in cities in that same country from going ahead and get going on working towards that goal. So you don't have to, in a sense, stop actors in society from moving ahead on any of the goals or any of the 169 targets. It's just that, a government cannot possibly do everything to have the same speed on everything. big area for me, and then I'll stop, in terms of fostering people's participation, is in tracking progress. It's not enough to basically have government reports that provide status updates on how they're doing in making progress towards goals as these 15 years go by. In addition to that, we should have the second opinion of people around the world, basically keeping track of what's happening to the goals and providing their assessment of whether we are making progress or not. And if you can have that kind of we the people second opinion as a standard item as we move forward with follow-up and review and the high-level political forum and all of that, I think that could be a very powerful and necessary complement to the more formalized process.
Thank you very much, Olav, for participating in this interview. The content of the interview will be a part of qualitative analysis that includes other 19 respondents from various institutions and representing different actors in the international community. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Okay.
Just in time too. That's good.